And then it really gets interesting. That's what this all seems to want us to believe. Let's put it that way. This is and then people say, well, then if the world is fractal, then is it not true that the evolution of an individual could be extrapolated to be the evolution of the whole system? And then that leads to the mildly unsettling possibility that what this great transition we're moving toward is not T1 for everybody, but D1 for everybody. In other words, death. Death is the thing that really stirs us. We don't know what it is. We don't know whether we're supposed to flee from it or race toward it. And people say, well, then is it possible that, just to take the date 2012 as a marker, is it possible that everyone would die? It's possible. I've looked a lot at asteroid impactors because the people who study these things know that this is not an act of God or a miracle, that this happens. It has happened, it will happen, and it happens on different scales, from things like meteor crater in Arizona 50,000 years ago. Everything within 800 miles of that impact died instantly 50,000 years ago. But 65 million years ago, an object the size of Manhattan impacted in the Gulf of Campeche, and nothing on this planet larger than a chicken walked away from that. Well, now, if you talk about ecological disaster, there's never been one like that in the history of the planet. Thousands, tens of thousands of species died. Entire orders of animals were wiped out. The continents were rearranged. But guess what? The flowering plants, of which we are so fond, and our own dear selves, of which we are even more fond, would never have had a chance to insinuate themselves into the evolutionary life of this planet had there not been that clearing out of the reptilian climax. So then you look at this and say, well, was this the greatest mass extinction in history, or the greatest leap forward for biology in the history of the planet? And the answer is, it was both. Out of enormous death comes an enormous surge in the domain of organic novelty. I prefer to think that it is not a planetary catastrophe or a mass dying. And I'll tell you why. And this is a place, now we're working from the notebooks. In other words, this is not prepared for public consumption. This is something I meditate on in the baths. I can't help but notice that as novelty increases in time, according to this model, that the spatial domain of its focus narrows. So, for instance, in the early phase of the time wave, the stars are condensing and the galaxies are forming. We could say that the entire universe is moving toward novelty. But once carbon chemistry appears, the cycles of fusion in stars and production of heavy elements and things like this are stabilized. And the domain of novelty becomes biology. And for 1.5 billion years, biology evolves and adumbrates its forms and moves from the prokaryotes to the eukaryotes to the multicellular. The conquest of the land begins. But then, with the emergence of language-using and tool-using higher primates, in a sense, novelty leaves the domain of organic life. And organic life becomes metastable and evolution and mutation happens. But where the action has moved to is into to the epigenetic domain entirely defined on this planet by human activities. And so the human beings are the carriers of novelty. And that has gone on until about, pick a number, but basically 3,000 to 2,500 years ago. And then the novelty seems to concentrate itself in Southern Europe. The Greeks take some kind of step that no other people have ever taken. You know, even today, if you go around the world and visit tribal people and ask to see their art, they show you, if you ask to see depictions of human beings, they show you symbolic depictions of human beings. That's what an African mask is. That's what a Sepik River carving is. These are symbols of human beings. The Greek mind crossed an invisible boundary, and somebody said, let's take a block of marble or some clay, and let's not symbolize a human being. Let us make a perfect topological simulacrum of a human being, a face that looks like a face, flesh that looks like flesh. It was as though the Greek consciousness rose to the surface and left the unconscious behind, and the eyes were opened and no longer saw through symbolic filters, but instead said, nature in and of itself. This is the foundation for science and art as we know it. So the novelty then was largely in the hands, and largely, I'm rushing here, exceptions are obvious, in the hands of what we call the Greco-Roman mind. And so it has been for a couple of thousand years. Well, then pick a number, 100 years or so ago, it further contracted the novelty. It further contracted itself into the high-tech industrial democracies. And now it has further retracted. One of the problems we're having in our society is there's a bifurcation going on in society. Part of us are going with the new novel technologies that knit us together and make us dimensionless telepathic creatures through the internet. And some people are digging in their heels and saying, oh, no, beyond newspapers I can't go. And so those people are being left behind. They are practicing old-style culture in an equilibrium state. So now it isn't even all of the high-tech populations of the industrial democracies. As we get closer to 2012, if this process proceeds, then the source of novelty will constrict even further. And I guess it may eventually come down to one or two people or a group of people, and maybe those people will make a machine, and then the machine will be the source of the novelty, and all of us will be put out to the pasture of equilibrium and maintain the rest of the world as it was, but the novelty will have focused to some kind of incredibly intense point. And so, looking at it from that model, it's hard to see how it could be an asteroid impact or something like that, because that would affect all biology, all geology. It would completely violate this long-standing tendency of the novelty to concentrate itself. Well, now the Buddhists have an interesting perspective that maybe has something to do with this. There are many schools of Buddhism, and I don't want to get into that, but there are schools which hold the following doctrine, that if a single person could attain enlightenment, then all sentient beings in the cosmos would attain enlightenment instantly.